What's the word? Today I wanted to make a video in the realm of anthropology that might seem a little controversial on the surface. I was actually inspired by a video titled The Science Behind Race in Sports, which had broken down the genetic physiological differences between ethnicities which prove advantageous in certain sports. The video made me ponder if I could do the same, or the same could be applied to esports as well. Now before you say, no, you cannot apply same logic towards gaming because there are no significant or marginal differences in intelligence or logical processes between each and I say to that, you're absolutely right. I want to preface this video by saying in no means is the goal of this video to pipeline the subject at the hand of the old tiresome race and IQ question or a dog whistle for the infamous bell curve. This is not a video about intelligence quotient and not even a video specifically about intelligence. Rather, I want to discuss why certain ethnic backgrounds excel in specific genres of video games from a competitive standpoint. I'm merely interested in discussing these anthropological observations and how each ethnic background might have an advantage in a respective game genre, whether it be a physiological or psychological advantage or an environmental advantage which leads them in a noticeable statistical difference in performance compared to other races. I will try not to make this into a historical video about the origins of each competitive community. However, I will be providing some background on how these communities developed to give us a clear insight about how ethnic stratification occurred in each competitive game genre, and will try to use statistics and scientific data whenever I can to try to back my reasoning for my explanations. Also, forgive me if I'm a little facetious throughout the video. That's just how I am, so don't get offended with anything I say throughout this video.
Peace, peace.
And I also wanted to point out that anyone can excel in any video game genre, as there is much more diversity within video games and esports than there is in physical sports due to the fact that they are quite accessible to anyone from any background, even those with disabilities. So if you can't break into esports, don't go on and blame your race and point to this video as an excuse for your lack of skill.
The most important thing for me is drama.
So I'm not going to overtalk it any further. Let's get into it. I'm going to begin by talking about arguably the most diverse and oldest competitive gaming genre, the genre that had esports before esports existed, and that is the FGC, the fighting game community.
We're taking them to Dust City.
For over 30 years since the early 90s, the FGC has seen a myriad of players come and go with a vast and colorful array of characters, bringing personality and life to the genre and giving it a distinct identity that no other esport could ever match. Professional fighting game players range from people that come from every walk of life and every ethnic background imaginable, from white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and etc. And all ethnicities perform reasonably high at a competitive level. This is due to the grassroots tight-knit nature of the community, which initially originated in the arcade scene back in the 90s and early 2000s, where people from all types of backgrounds would come there after school or work to challenge potential opponents at each machine. It didn't matter what your race was or your age. A 12-year-old black kid could body a 22-year-old Latino man in the first to 3 or vice versa. Didn't matter who you were, anybody could get the sticks. This also served as a sort of great filter and natural gatekeeper for low-level players, spammers, and scrubs from ever really astroturfing the community, as only the best could practice combos on these machines and stay on due to the limited number of machines at the arcade. And members of the community would only discuss tech or technicals amongst each other, keeping the community tight as possible. The location of these arcades also proved to be very accessible to everybody, no matter the income bracket or ethnicity, as popular local arcades were usually located within urban and metropolitan areas. Additionally, due to the paid nature and limited number of arcade cabinets in each arcade, only the best could hang for the longest at each machine. The Akumas, the Mishimas, the real king of the jungles. The FGC was a niche yet solidified community for decades, with games like Street Fighter 2, Marvel vs. Capcom, and Kings of Fighters being the games which had propped up the community for years until the rise of online gaming. This is when the FGC started to become global, and now countries with their own fighting game communities can now compete with each other online rather than travel thousands of miles for a tournament being hosted in someone's basement. Games such as Tekken 5 DR, Tag 2, Mortal Kombat Deception, and of course Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Free Marble, were all games that really sparked the explosion of growth of the FGC, and it had become more diverse than ever before, with new competitors from across the world now being able to compete and connect with each other, negating the issue of language barriers and long distance travel, as internet allowed the community to connect with each other, as well as big events such as EVO or Evolution really skyrocketing the popularity of the FGC and allowing the top competitors around the world to prove their mettle on the big screen at main events rather than some dude's basement that smelled like ass and asbestos. This was seen as the golden age of the FGC and its apex around these years of 2007 to 2013. When taking a look at the ethnic demographics of the community, sampling from top tournament competitors throughout the years of fighting games played at big events such as EVO, we see a diverse array of top competitors from different ethnicities from across the world. But before we go any further, and I digress on a loquacious tangent further explaining the deep lore of the FGC, which I can go at for hours, we must go back to the main topic at hand and discuss the ethnic factor. Let me explain why I started off talking about fighting games. When talking about fighting games, there is an apparent trend which can be seen not only in the FGC, but throughout all of esports. And due to the FGC's ethnic diversity, it helps accentuate this trend better than any other genre. We must address the top dogs of not only the FGC, but of all of esports. The one ethnic group which continue to dominate and take over every genre time and time again with ease, and it's not even close, and those are Asians.
What was that? Baker with a huge play, the QSS. I can't the tempo in, sweeps it up, and solidifies himself as the inaugural EVO Japan champion from the start of the season.
Asians have been the dominant contenders throughout the entire history of esports till this day. From gods in the FGC such as Daigo, Ni, Sako, Justin Wong, Takedo, Infiltration, and JDCR, to mobile legends like League goats like Faker, Uzi, and Showmaker, to strategy legends in StarCraft like Rain and Maru. Time and time again, a plethora of Asians seem to take home esports championships, and a great many of times with ease. They usually say, when it's a one-on-one, always bet on an Asian. It's almost became a meme and is a stereotype which all Asians face. An appropriate analogy of how dominant Asians are in esports would be how dominant black people are in American sports. But why is this? Why are Asians so good at gaming in general? Is there a genetic factor that comes into play when it comes to Asians performing better in gaming, or is it a little bit more complicated? Well, the explanation for this is very simplistic yet holds great profundity, and it has to do with two factors: history and culture. First, let's discuss the historical significance of gaming in several Asian countries and communities. In countries such as Japan and Korea, gaming has had a long and extensive history which go back decades even before the advent of esports. In Japan, not only gaming, but more specifically fighting games has a colored history in the nation. The birth of arcade games in the 70s and their rise to popularity in the 80s really propelled gaming to extensive popularity within Japan and later. When Japanese companies Nintendo and Sega birthed their home consoles to make gaming widely available to those who chose not to commute to arcades with the NES or Famicom in 1983 and the Master System in 1985, it was a done deal. Nearly 1/4 of every household in Japan had a gaming console, with 1/3 of its 61 million Famicoms being sold within the nation alone. But everyone who has visited Japan before knows that arcades have never taken a back seat and are popular as ever even till this day. Since arcade machines were an instant hit in Japan since the 70s, unlike Europe and America, where arcades were sparse and niche with limited popularity and tended to grow in popularity during the mid to late 80s and early 90s. These illustrious arcades, which illuminated the halls with their bright and garishly lurid rasterized pixels, had mass appeals to the Japanese people around the nation, particularly in Tokyo, with districts like Ikebukuro and Akihabara sporting the iconic gone but not forgotten Sega arcade. Arcade culture is ingrained into Japanese gaming culture period, and many Japanese children and adults, after a stressful day of work and school with the pressures of society weighing down on them more than any other society due to their work culture, many Japanese see these arcades as sort of an Eden in the East. In terms of fighting games, which genre we see the most Japanese compete in at a high competitive level, fighting games has always had a pivotal role in defining gaming culture in Japan, probably more than any other genre out there. Karate Champ was the first 1v1 fighting game to hit Japanese arcades and home consoles in 1984, and it was a massive hit, with it being the highest grossing arcade game and best selling console game in Japan for 5 years, which helped mark the rise in popularity of fighting game genre in the East. After seeing its massive popularity, companies such as Capcom saw an opportunity to take advantage of the mass appeal of fighting games in the Japanese market and released Street Fighter II, which instigated the explosive growth and galvanized the permanent residency of the genre with not only Japanese gaming, but gaming around the world, as Street Fighter II has standardized and defined the genre of fighting games to this day. Those are just the spark notes, but without conjecture, we can see why from simply history alone, why Japanese competitors are so highly prevalent within the fighting game genre. There was also more appeal to the Japanese audience during the time as well, since most fighting games were exclusively dropped in Japan and released years prior to the international release, giving the Japanese an inherent advantage to overseas competitors. The next component of why Japanese competitors are so dominant in fighting games also has to do with their culture. One aspect of culture which helped push fighting games to its heights in Japan was the significance of martial arts in Japan. Japan is the birthplace of a plethora of martial arts ranging from sumo, kenjutsu, jujutsu, aikido, judo, kendo, and of course karate, and many more martial arts. Karate, of course, being the most popular, as it was promoted to citizens and to students as an easy and efficient way for self-defense, while also instilling the age-old Japanese values and philosophies of Bushido, Aiki, Kokoro, and Kiai into the average man, and instilling discipline into them as well. The prevalence of martial arts helped aid the popularity of the fighting game genre, and the art of fighting wasn't really mainstream or popularized until the release of Karate Kid and Pride FC, which helped catapult the popularity of martial arts in the West. The other aspect of culture which helped form dominant Japanese contenders was the aforementioned work and school culture. Japan is known for having the most brutal and strenuous work cultures out of any culture, with many working 70+ hours a week, and for students, a cumbersome course load which oftentimes feels crippling. This work culture being reinforced by the societal expectations and pressures to become a productive member of society, and conformity also helps stress this aspect of society on younger generations. Fighting games were not only seen as an escape to those societal burdens for many Japanese young men, but also as a way out of the suffocating expectations of society. From interviews from many Japanese pro players, you often hear them say that they got so good at their games from spending so much time on arcade machines to forget the stresses and burdens of school and the trepidation of going to university to become a lifelong salaryman.
うちの自分の父親は武道とかそういう、あとは哲学とかなんかそういうのが好きだったみたいで、でもどっちもやっぱり当時もその生活していけるようなものではなかったから、おじいさんもうちの父親に、同じようにそのひいおじいさんにおじいさんが言われたようにちゃんと自分の職を持てと。うちの父親はそのことが、うちの父親も何か一つのことをやらせたかったみたいなんですよね。で、そのまあありがたい、そういう結果自分は格闘ゲームっていうものに出会って、それに立場が。
This was for many Japanese pros a way out, and a way out that they were good at. This is why we see the Japanese as the primary dominating force within the fighting game genre.
Download complete.
Now, as for the Korean neighbors, while Koreans are typically only dominant in one fighting game, Tekken, for reasons I'll explain later, Koreans are the dominating force in several genres of gaming for reasons quite similar to the Japanese. With an intensively competitive academic environment and work culture known for overworking its employees, Koreans have a similar incentive as the Japanese to become great at video games, with 12-hour work days not being uncommon and the difficulty of entering a good school which requires cramming and sometimes even over 12 hours of studying a day. It would seem there would be no time for gaming in a country that pushed such pressures on its young populace. But due to the lack of social mobility and grim prospects of making it into a prestigious school, the odds are usually stacked against many young people, which forces them to quit or just give up entirely on school, which gives them a considerable free time. And since these young people cannot afford cram school, private tutors, and don't have access to higher paying jobs, they typically don't have the necessary means to pay for home consoles or gaming PCs. Enter PC bangs, or internet cafes, which became prevalent in the late 90s in South Korea. These internet cafes offered a cheap and affordable alternative for many Korean young men who wanted to spend their free time to escape the pressures of their society, akin to arcades in Japan, with usable high-speed internet with a variety of games being offered at just $1 an hour. However, although many Koreans find escape in PC gaming, the brutal work ethic and expectation of being great had also permeated into Korean gaming itself, so the rigorous attitude attitude towards becoming better, with methods such as cramming and rote memorization utilized in academia proved to be effective when it came to improving in video games. Instead of studying 16 hours a day in school, however, they would just practice and study and develop game theory in video games. Gaming cafes also were a highly competitive environment which introduced competition of like-minded young men wanting to be the best, similar to how it is in school, which bred a highly competitive and try-hard environment where only the best would compete and develop tech. This was first apparent with StarCraft in 1999 and Warcraft in the early 2000s, which are the strategy games Koreans embraced as they were advertised as competitive games on release and was widely available in neighborhood PC bangs, leading to its massive popularity within Korea compared to the West, where the game and strategy genre itself was rather niche and only available with those with PCs capable of running the games. As for League, the reason why it's so popular in Korean is more abstract, since other popular MOBAs that came out before League such as Dota never really took off in Korea. However, I believe its popularity in Korea stemmed from several factors. First, it was free, which allowed it to be widely available in most, if not all, internet cafes and home computers. Second, it was an easy game to run, which not only allowed many more players with worse spec PCs to play the game, but also allowed for a higher frame rate, which is important in competitive games such as MOBAs, which also leads to point 3. It was seen as an RTS like StarCraft to many Koreans. There's a lot of elements from both games such as top-down point-and-click, resource management, minion management, and movement overlapped with each other. Finally, PC cafes had super fast internet, which allowed for low ping gameplay for Koreans, giving an entire technical advantage to Koreans, not only in terms of League, but also other competitive games, while Korea also hosting its own League server as early as Season 2 in 2011, only missing out on Season 1, which was, let's just say, a very different game for those who remember. Alongside these factors, esports teams tend to cast a small talent net which only select the best to compete in their teams, and when you have such a large population of players, the best of the best really are only competing at a high level. With all these factors in confluence, it's no surprise that Koreans come out on top in competitive games such as Overwatch, League, and StarCraft, with Korea being also one of the first countries to recognize esports as a professional career similar to physical sports, though professional esports players don't make nearly as much money. In terms of Tekken, however, Koreans tend to gravitate to games with a high skill ceiling due to the culture, and Tekken arguably has the highest skill ceiling out of any fighting game. The Korean FGC also never had to travel a great distance to compete and play locally, as the local arcades like internet cafes provided a space for fighting game players to converge and battle with each other while also learning tech. Tekken was also available on console, which allowed the committed to further practice new tech at home when they're not at arcades. Overall, the extreme dedication, sheer focus, and commitment of Korean players bred by highly competitive environments allowed them to be so great at a wide variety of genres, leading them to be the dominant ethnic group in the esports. Another Asian ethnic group which have recently broke out into the esports scenes are the Chinese, as China has cemented itself as the leading nation in game development in esports in the last decade in terms of commercial growth. The Chinese are the world champions in a deluge of games, but they are easily the most dominant in the mobile esports genre. China was the first government to recognize esports as far back as the early 2000s and home of the vast majority of mobile game publishing companies such as Tencent, who were central in the development of esports in China. China also hosts the most tournaments for esports as well, with 50 already being hosted in 2024. The cultural reasons also help propel Chinese players into international stardom, as China has a very nationalistic culture and have great pride in competitive performance internationally, whether it's physical or esports. So the Chinese government has made provisions to promote upcoming Chinese esports stars, even lifting and giving leniency to the stringent Chinese laws which restrict game time for minors to 1 hour a day, which limit the talent pipeline of young Chinese competitive players. However, there are workarounds to these restrictions in some mobile games, which highlights them as the only competitive avenue for a lot of young players. In combination to the esports aspect, China, like Korea and Japan, have a highly competitive school environment which places great stress on young population and pressures them to be great, especially as a nationalistic country such as China, who expects the very best from their youth. The one factor that connects all Asian ethnicities in their sheer prowess in competitive gaming, as seen with Japan, Korea, and China, are their culture, which conditions young people to work hard and strenuously. There is an inherent competitive component in all of these East Asian cultures, which give us an anthropological explanation as to why many Asians tend to be best gamers in esports. In terms of Southeast Asian ethnicities such as Filipinos, Vietnamese, and Indonesians, these nations tend to be lower income compared to East Asian nations, which lead to lack of noticeable presence in PC esports. But since mobile phones and games are widely available, we see a high population of highly skilled and professional Southeast Asian mobile game players, with countries such as the Philippines being a mobile first nation and recognized esports as a legitimate sport back in 2017. India also has recently had an almost meteoric rise in esports in recent years, as popular games such as PUBG Mobile was highly advertised in India, making it highly visible to the general population, as well as the prominence of major tournaments and the wide availability in India, with India being one of the leading tech markets in terms of mobile device purchases, allowing people from any socioeconomic background to play. This gives succinct explanation why Indians are so dominant in mobile battle arenas such as PUBG. In terms of chess has always been widely seen as a prestigious and sophisticated game to play in India, as its history stems back thousands of years, being one of the first nations to develop chess. Chess clubs and tournaments are also hosted in nearly every school, as chess is seen as an intellectual option in terms of leisure. There was never a stigma for chess in India like there was with video games, and Indians have a highly education-centric culture, with many Indians outperforming Western nations in exam performances by a significant margin. Since chess is seen as a scholarly and noble game in India, it's no wonder there are so many Indian players. Now it's time to discuss the most broad and most prevalent ethnic group in gaming, Europeans. Since white people is too broad of a term and there are dozens of different ethnic subcategories of white, I will be covering those subcategories of European rather than all European ethnic groups in one swath. Europeans or white people are typically the main group of people represented in all of esports. People of European ancestry can be seen in every competitive gaming genre around the world. There is simply a high population of Europeans from across the world. When breaking down which genre Europeans are best at, then we can see a more detailed view of which ethno-cultural group of Europeans are dominant in each genre and the reasons why. When we think of one genre which Europeans particularly dominate in esports, is first-person shooters, which a majority of champions and professional players are of European descent. But more specifically, when we look at games such as CSGO and Dota 2, which is a MOBA, it is apparent that Slavic Europeans are the dominating force in these games. When hopping into a CSGO lobby, it isn't uncommon to hear what is the reason for the prevalence of Slavs, and particularly Russians, in both CSGO and Dota 2? Well, the reasons are actually quite simple and are sort of similar to the popularity of League in Korea. It's cheap. The post-Soviet economy in Eastern Bloc nations left many Slavs with lower income to the West, and many could not afford or game on PCs. With CSGO as well as CS Source and CS, Source games were quite popular in the 2000s Russian and were extremely easy to run compared to other games at the time. You could until a few years ago, run Counter-Strike on a toaster, and the popularity of PC gaming cafes as being able to quickly install and play games in computer science classes facilitated the popularity of CS in Russia and other surrounding Slavic nations. You could also host LAN parties with friends, which helped spark friendly competitions with other players, which later gave rise to esports in Russia, which was made into an official sport in 2004, which deemed them as cyber sports and also even had competitive gaming classes available. In terms of Dota, reasons were similar, but one aspect really popularized Dota in Eastern Europe, and that was Warcraft 3. Warcraft 3 was extremely cheap, did not require a powerful PC, and was easy to pirate, which piracy and digital pirate culture is very much prevalent in Russia. Warcraft 3 custom maps were also very popular in Russia at the time, and when Dota 2 came out, almost every Warcraft playing Russian hopped on it. When looking at both CS and Dota, they are both Valve games, which, as I mentioned, are not only quite easy to run, but is also on Steam, and Steam is very popular in Eastern Europe for this reason. In the 90s and 2000s, during the post-Soviet era, officially licensed games were very rare and expensive in Slavic nations, and game licensing, publication, and localization wasn't prioritized during the time. Russians and other Slavs were relegated to either purchasing expensive console games or pirating expensive PC games. This is when Valve came in and launched Steam, which, with the help of local publishers, allowed publication of most Steam games at local prices, which were 5 to 8 times cheaper than US prices. When fiber internet hit the scene, it allowed most Slavic players to game online comfortably, although with rather lackluster pings. With these factors in mind, there's no doubt why Slavs are as dominant as they are in CS and Dota, with the vast part of their gaming history revolving around the two games. Chess is also a game which has a history too long to cover in this video, but its prevalence and importance to Russia and previous Soviet states gives reason as to why there are so many Slavic Russian grandmasters and champions. Going back to CSGO, you may say, while there are Slavic all-time great players who dominate CS like Simple and Nico, most of CS is dominated by Scandinavians or Germanic Nordic Europeans. This is correct. Not only are Nordic players dominant in CSGO, but StarCraft as well, like Koreans. A plethora of godlike players hail from these Scandinavian countries countries such as Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, despite not having any notable advantage over any other European country. There's a great video which highlights the reasons why Scandinavia is so good at esports, but I'll gloss over a few key ones. Scandinavian countries are high income and have a well-established digital infrastructure ahead of most European countries, with high-speed internet connections being commonplace in many households, which allow for comfortable online gaming experience, having to not worry about latency and internet outages which may hinder playtime. PC gaming is also very popular among Scandinavian countries, with console gaming even taking a back seat when it comes to game development in these nations, which provides Scandinavians to ample access to games. The cold climate of Scandinavian countries also proved to be a suitable biome for gaming culture to grow, as most people are stuck inside to play games during the harsh Nordic winters. Countries like Sweden had also produced some of the first esport pioneers who inspired the younger generation of gamers. Pro CS players like Hedon helped pave the path for many Swedes to perform in esports, and the Scandinavian representation helped bolster the numbers of Nordic players who would later become champions themselves. This also benefits the economy, as Scandinavians put more money into esports, allowing for more sponsors and allowing Scandinavian players to travel and compete internationally. Lastly, since Nordic countries have a lower income inequality and have fairly equitable economies with social provisions like social security and free healthcare and education, allows for people to enter esports without having to worry about financial burden or stress about getting a career, which would allow for greater economic mobility. In terms of Western Europeans like the French, they have a strong prominence within esports as well, with players like Kenny S and the French team Vitali being dominant forces in CSGO. Even in games such as Rocket League, the French also dominate in respect to any other country. France's rise in esports is likely underpinned by strong government support of esports in Europe, with French President Emmanuel Macron vocalizing his support for esports as a legitimate means of sport. Western Europeans in general are the main competitors in terms of a racing game genre as well, most likely due to the popularity and historical prominence of motorsports in Europe, with the number of racing organizations and championship circuits originating there. So thank you, JSR Lee Campbell. In terms of ethnicities in America, the explanation for competitive performance differences between ethnic groups is a little more perspicacious, since the US is very diverse and competitive pro gamers are quite abundant amongst all races. In terms of Americans, it is less about a certain ethnic background dominating in a specific genre, but rather more so about the environment, since American champions and esports players are seen all around all genres of competitive gaming. However, if we were to look at each ethnic group's performance in esports, there is a distinguishable trend of which ethnicities are most dominant in each genre. White American pro gamers tend to be more prevalent in the competitive game genres such as battle royales, MOBAs, arena shooters, and FPSs, while Black American pro gamers tend to be more prevalent in fighting games and sports games. Possible explanation as to why Black people are only prevalent in these esports is most likely due to a couple of factors, which include population size, since Black people only comprise of 13% of the population, so representation amongst esports is inherently going to be lower. Socioeconomic differences, which could in turn cause access to competitive gaming opportunities to be more difficult for Black people in a lower income bracket compared to their white counterparts, potentially hostile environments when it comes to gaming. Not going to shout the spooky R word here, but we do know what happens when a Black person uses open mic in COD and a lot of other games. The gamer word tends to be thrown out with speed and efficiency. Ah yes, I remember the first time I was called a nigga.
Good times, good times.
However, the reasons why Black people are so prevalent in competitive fighting games is possibly due to the aforementioned income disparity. Since a lot of Black families could not afford high-cost gaming PCs, many Black kids gravitated towards local arcades in urban areas to get their gaming fix. This also meant that most Black people would also likely own a console rather than a PC, which also sported the newest fighting games in which they could convene with friends and battle with friends from school and locals offline and practice tech whenever they wanted. The 1v1 nature of fighting games could also be a factor in their appeal to Black people in America, since fighting and boxing plays a huge role in Black culture in America, with lots of historical significance going back to the 1800s. In respect to the sports games like 2K and Madden, Black people are more represented in physical sports, and the majority of the NBA is Black, since sports is ingrained in Black culture as well. More players gravitate to sports games as well, leading to more pro-Black competitive esports players. Asian Americans and Hispanic pro players are also more sparse due to the population size, but can also be seen playing at a high level throughout several game genres. Speaking of Hispanics, we see that Hispanics mainly compete in COD Mobile, FIFA, and fighting games. COD is very popular in multiple Latin communities and countries, and FIFA, like Black people in 2K, soccer is very much ingrained in Hispanic culture, which gives us reason as to why many pro FIFA players are Latino. Now with fighting games, there's one fighting game which reigns as king in Latin FGC, and particularly in Mexico. When hopping online, you're most likely to get watched by a Mexican in this game. King of Fighters.
Viva Mexico!
has a long-standing tradition in Mexico since the 90s, more than any other fighting game. The reason for this was MVS and Neo Geo. Arcade machines were quite expensive to own and maintain, so an inexpensive solution to this was the Neo Geo and MVS, which local arcade owners could swap cartridges for popular games at a fraction of the price it would cost to buy a new machine. King of Fighters was exclusive to the Neo Geo, so Mexican store and arcade owners would purchase these new Neo Geo fighting games and boot them up on these machines. These garnered a lot of traffic since these arcade machines were very popular and prevalent throughout a lot of small Mexican grocery stores near schools, so a lot of kids would go after school to these stores and arcades to play KOF. This had led to a lot of Mexican players becoming so good at KOF since it was the most prevalent and available fighting game in Mexico compared to any other game, giving them an edge. Esports in Africa was near non-existent until recently due to economic factors, so we don't see many African professional gamers. However, Africa seems to be the new frontier in terms of esports, as a large influx of African gamers are coming online as the gaming industry grows in Africa, as consoles and mobile devices become more readily available to different countries in Africa. We may see big names and tournaments come out of Africa in the coming years, but currently African presence in esports is pretty minimal. In the Middle East, the most prominent esport genre to consolidate is fighting games. Saudi Arabia's particular foray into fighting games has more so to do with monetization, as Saudi Arabia sees esports as an investment in the coming future, leading to the government funding a third of SNK and 5% of Capcom. This leads to the government incentivizing young players to get to a high level to become professionals so they can compete in state-sponsored tournaments. Lastly, there is one ethnicity in the Southeast Asia and near Middle East who dominate in one game, Tekken, and they are proving to be the real king of Iron Fist and the antithesis to Korean Tekken players, and those are Pakistanis. Pakistanis' meteoric rise to Tekken domination seems to have came out of nowhere. Though taking a glance behind the scene, we see some key reasons as to how they became so good at Tekken, and how their rise to domination also sparked the growth of fighting game popularity in Pakistan as well. Arcade culture in Pakistan is very prominent compared to their neighboring countries, since internet in Pakistan is subpar. This led to many kids playing and practicing Tekken offline in arcades and on console, which allowed them to hone their skills in practice mode endlessly, which helped turn many Pakistani players into lab demons and silent killers when faced with unsuspecting opponents. Arslan Ash was one of these silent killers who was the first to dominate Korean Tekken players, which was unheard of prior to 2019. After Arslan's rise to sudden fame as the Pakistani underdog who slew the Korean gods of Tekken, this gave way to the explosion of more Pakistani Tekken players to prove their mettle on the world stage, and media coverage has only encouraged the growth of Pakistani esports players to even further. In the coming years, we may see Pakistanis take over fighting games and could see a shift in the demographics and top players in the FGC. And there you have it. I hope I provided sufficient explanation as to the sociological reasons why many of these ethnic groups and nationalities seem to perform better in certain video game genres than others. I know I couldn't cover every single ethnicity, but please let me know any you think I should have covered and tell me what I missed in the comments below. I'd be glad to learn something new. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, my goal of this video is not to be ostentatious or controversial, but to hope to provide insight and clarity as to the factors which cause marginal differences in performances between ethnicities without the factor of genetics coming into play. What I learned from making this video is that as hard as I searched, there are no significant differences in physiology which allow for advantages in esports, though research and data might be sparse and not sufficient enough yet. I guess this was more so of a sociological and historical video rather than a video with a biological basis to it, but I believe the reasons I discussed in this video still give a merit as a proper explanation for the performance differences in gaming throughout ethnicities. I also wanted to add an addendum that I did want to also discuss the topic of the role that sex and gender identity plays in competitive gaming as well, since throughout the years, though underrepresented, we are seeing more women and trans representation throughout esports. When studying the aggregate, we are seeing women being represented more in esports as the industry grows and perform relatively high in genres such as arena shooters, and competitive trans gamers statistically represented more and perform relatively higher than others in fighting games such as Guilty Gear and in competitive scenes such as in Smash and in speedrunning. But I didn't want to expand the scope of the video and lose focus of the main subject at hand by bloating the video. And also, I feel like I'm not qualified yet to discuss that topic and need to brush up on my research on this phenomenon as well. But I am highly intrigued on discussing this aspect of the subject, so I might make a part 2 in a later date, so stay tuned. As a closing point, as I said in the beginning of the video, don't let sociological factors determine your merit in video games. If your dream is to become a pro esports player, do it. Physiology is less of a limiting factor in esports like it is in real sports rather. Esports only require a lot of time, dedication, and discipline. and maybe some Adderallers in if we're talking about PEDs. Now is a better time than ever to pursue that dream, as esports has become larger than ever and is now taken seriously on a world stage as a legitimate sport. There are more players now than ever, and it's only going to get harder as it grows. So whether you want to see yourself pull off that taunt jet upper on the big screen at EVO, or pull off a 3 consecutive one tap at PGL Stockholm, go out and do it. You never know till you try. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and maybe you learned something new. Now excuse me while I go ahead and hop on Street Fighter 6 to get bodied by a mashing bison. Thanks for watching, and as always, Godspeed.